So, two roles for the new Batman movie have been cast and announced today, and I wanted to take a moment to talk about my feelings about the reveal. And this is all off the top of my head, by the way, so I apologize if this sounds more like a rant. It is a rant. But before I go into that, I wanted to quickly express my feelings about how I feel about Batman as a franchise. Because I've been a Batman fan for years. And I know this isn't a very original opinion, but I find him to be the most interesting and deep of all the superheroes out there. Now, when it comes to superhero movies, I never go in hoping that they will stay true to the source material because a lot of the time I don't know what the source material is. For the most part, I've never read comics and I have no knowledge about the backstory of a lot of these guys. I just want to see a good movie. But Batman is one of those rare phenomenon for me where I actually do know the backstory, and so it's one of the only times where I can understand why people would get upset when they do something wrong with regard to the source material. I, for one, love the new Batman films far above and beyond the Tim Burton franchise. The Tim Burton franchise looked really, really good, but they weren't really about anything. There was very little insight into the characters of either Batman or Bruce Wayne, and they seemed to rely on the villains of the week to sell tickets rather than the story. And here I thought that a movie was supposed to be sold on its story, so, you know. In my opinion, Christopher Nolan took the concept of Batman and turned it into a real series of real films. Batman Begins was released at a time where the Batman franchise was considered to be a plague that no studio wanted to touch. Batman and Robin had killed the franchise years before, and even though a great deal of time had passed, the studios were still really apprehensive about getting back into a Batman film series. And so the first thing that impressed and surprised me about Batman Begins was that even though this was supposed to be the movie that would prove to the studio that a Batman film could sell again, it didn't really have a sales hook. Most would have preferred to play it safe and get a really, really well-known villain attached to the screenplay, like the Joker or the Riddler, something that would grab an audience's attention by the name alone. But even though so much was riding on him to get this movie to float, Nolan chose to feature two villains that very few people have heard of, the Scarecrow and Ra's al Ghul. I'm not saying that no one had ever heard of these two, but they certainly are not as commonly known as the classic Batman villains, and they certainly are not a selling point the way those villains could have been. But these two were chosen because they worked in the story, and the story is the reason Batman Begins became a success. Nolan obviously felt very confident that he could rely on his story to sell this movie, and it turned out to be very true. And then came The Dark Knight, which elevated the series into absolute greatness. If Batman Begins was a great Batman movie, then The Dark Knight was a great movie that just happened to be a Batman movie. Very similar to the way that Star Trek II was a great movie that just happened to be a Star Trek movie. I didn't like The Dark Knight as much as everybody else did the first time I saw it. And you can go and read my written review and see that I had kind of a lukewarm reaction to it. But sometimes I don't really know how I'm going to feel about a movie until I've seen it a few times. And today it's one of my favorite movies, and it's in my top 5 of the best movies I've ever seen, as a matter of fact. Although I still thought the motorcycle was fucking stupid. Batman Begins was good for obvious reasons. It was a very tight-knit story with good characters and lots of entertainment value. But The Dark Knight is so interwoven with ideas and subjects regarding peace, anarchy, terrorism, morality, and so many other things that it takes watching it a few times to really grasp everything that Nolan is trying to do with the screenplay. So now we're fast approaching the production of The Dark Knight Rises. Now, how they got stuck with that stupid-ass title is beyond me, but it's not that important. They could call this thing The Man with the Pointy Ears, and I wouldn't really care as long as the movie is good. Nothing is known yet about what the story will be about, but we do know who the antagonists will be. Anne Hathaway and Tom Hardy have been cast to play two villains. Hardy will play Bane, and Hathaway will play Selina Kyle / Catwoman. I've never seen Hathaway in anything, so I don't really know if this is an appropriate casting choice, but based on Nolan's previous decisions, I trust his judgment. Bane will be played by Tom Hardy, whose name is legendary for playing Shinzon in Star Trek Nemesis. Well, maybe not legendary, but it never fails to get a big laugh. No, seriously, the way he played that role was not the problem. I can see Hardy playing Bane very well, but fuck me, would he have been a perfect choice for Mr. Freeze? I mean, God, Freeze always gets the shaft in these movies, don't you think? Still, I like what Nolan is doing here. In Batman Begins, we got largely unknown villains, at least unknown to the average person. Then in The Dark Knight, he gave us the Joker and Two-Face, who were both very well known. This time, it's a combination of the two. We have one really well-known character and one not so well-known. Once again, at least to the average person. I'm sure there are plenty of people listening to my voice right now who know who Bane is. Most people, I think, don't. But Catwoman and Bane are very similar, actually. They're two characters who kind of strike out on their own in vigilantism in their own ways. So I can see this working well in a screenplay. But I think people who don't know who Bane is are going to be pleased and surprised at what an interesting character he is, assuming they write him correctly. They certainly can't do any worse than Batman and Robin, where all he did was pretty much make fucking Frankenstein noises. I'm also interested in the portrayal of Catwoman that isn't just about her being off her nut. Selina Kyle was not crazy, and I never understood why they always had to go down the fucking crazy road in the Tim Burton films. Everyone was doing what they were doing because they were crazy in his films. Selina's story is so much deeper and more complicated than that, and I really look forward to seeing Nolan's take on it. Christopher Nolan has said that this will be the last film in his Batman franchise. I think that this will probably be the last film that he writes, but you know how these studios like to squeeze every last drop of blood out of a franchise they can, so we'll see. The new Batman franchise was very important. It proved that a reboot of popular but failed franchises was viable, even with regard to Star Trek. I mean, Star Trek, for God fucking sake. This is a film series that has had a tremendous impact, and I'm actually very sorry to see it go, but hopefully it will go out with a bang. So, we'll see in 2012. Oh, and lastly, Christian Bale, if you're listening, I know you probably get this all the time, try something other than the Cookie Monster voice this time. The end.